After her father-in-law death, wife lie her husband that he had left $80 million, and that one quiet lie became the most powerful weapon a betrayed woman ever used to burn down everything her enemies built. Before we continue the story, please take a second to like and subscribe. Your support truly helps me and my family keep creating more stories. Also, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Elijah Brooks built everything from nothing. That was the part people in Atlanta always talked about, how a man from the south side of Atlanta, Georgia, with no connections and no silver spoon, turned a small construction company into a billion-dollar real estate empire that stretched from Buckhead to downtown. His name was on buildings. His handshake was worth more than most people's contracts. He was the kind of man who made a room feel different just by walking into it. And then one Tuesday morning he was gone. No warning, no long hospital stay. Just a phone call at 6:30 in the morning that changed Imani Brooks's life in under 30 seconds. She had been awake already. She was always awake before the rest of the house. That was something Elijah had noticed about her from the very beginning, the way she carried herself quietly, the way she paid attention to things other people missed. He used to tell her she had the eyes of someone who understood the world better than she let on. She stood in the kitchen of their Atlanta estate when the call came in. The sun was barely up. The city outside the tall glass windows was still slow, still waking. She set her coffee cup down. She listened to the doctor's voice. She said very little, and when the call ended she stood completely still for a long time. Not because she was in shock. Because the moment that phone call ended, something cold and clear moved through her. A feeling she could not name right away. It was not just grief. It was something sharper. Something that told her, before she even had a reason to believe it, that the next few weeks were going to require everything she had. She drove to the hospital alone. She did not call Darius first. She did not call Vivienne. She got into her car before sunrise and drove through the quiet Atlanta streets with the radio off and her hands steady on the wheel. Elijah was already gone when she arrived. He looked peaceful. He looked the way strong men always look when life finally asks them to rest. She sat beside him for a long time. She held his hand, and she whispered something to him that no one else heard. When she walked back out into the hospital hallway, Darius was just arriving. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been interrupted by bad news, not broken by it. He hugged her briefly, said the right words. Vivienne arrived 20 minutes later in all black, already performing grief before she had even seen the body. Imani watched both of them. She said very little. She was already paying attention. The house went quiet by 9 o'clock that night. Darius had taken 2 phone calls during dinner, both from numbers Imani did not recognize, and by the time the plates were cleared, he had disappeared into his office and closed the door. Vivienne had left the estate by 8:30 in the evening, kissing Darius on the cheek in a way that lasted just a half-second too long. Imani noticed. She always noticed. She waited until the house was completely still. Then she went to Elijah's private study on the 2nd floor, the room he had always kept locked, the room only she had a key to because he had quietly pressed a copy into her hand 8 months ago without explanation. He had simply looked at her and said, "You will know when to use it." She used it that night. The study smelled like him, old wood, leather, and something warm. She sat at his desk and opened the bottom drawer where he kept the things that mattered most to him. Underneath a leather journal she found a small digital recorder. It was already set to play. She pressed the button. What came out of that recorder broke something inside her, not because it was surprising, but because it confirmed every quiet feeling she had been carrying for months and telling herself she was wrong about. It was a conversation, recorded clearly. Darius's voice was unmistakable, Vivienne's even more so. They were talking about Elijah's estate, about his mental state, about how to position themselves legally, about a lawyer in Midtown Atlanta who was willing to help redirect the trust structure before the old man's health declined any further. Vivienne used the phrase "before he changes his mind" 3 times. Darius laughed once, a short, flat sound, and said the timing needed to be right. They were not grieving a father. They were scheduling an inheritance. Imani turned the recorder off. She sat in the dark of Elijah's study for a long time. The city of Atlanta glowed faintly through the curtains. She did not cry. She had passed the point of crying somewhere between the hospital hallway and the drive home. What she felt now was something different, something that lived below emotion. It was clarity. She opened Elijah's journal. Inside the front cover in his careful handwriting were 4 words, "Protect what we built." She closed the journal slowly. She placed the recorder inside her bag. and she sat up straight in the chair that had belonged to the only man in that house who had ever truly seen her, and she made a decision so calm, so deliberate, so completely without panic that it would have frightened anyone who understood what she was capable of. She was not going to run. She was going to stay, and she was going to make them believe they had already won. She chose a Saturday morning to plant the lie. Darius was in a good mood that morning, relaxed, comfortable, the kind of mood that comes when a person believes everything is moving in their direction. He was sitting at the kitchen island in their Atlanta home with coffee and his phone, scrolling through something, unbothered. Elijah had only been gone 11 days. The house still had fresh flowers from the funeral arrangements. Imani sat across from him. She waited until he looked up. Then she said it quietly, the way people say things they are not supposed to say, like she was trusting him with something fragile and secret. She told him that before Elijah passed, he had come to her privately. She said Elijah had explained that he set aside a separate trust outside of the main estate specifically for Darius. She said the amount in that trust was $80 million. Darius put his coffee cup down. She watched his face change. It was not subtle. The relaxed expression tightened into something more focused, more alert. His eyes sharpened. She had seen that look before, not on a grieving son but on a businessman who just heard numbers that interested him. She continued. She told him the trust was structured in a complicated way and that the release process required her signature and her cooperation because Elijah had insisted on it. She said she was telling him because she believed he deserved to know and because she wanted them to handle it together. She used the word together very carefully. Darius asked her 3 questions in a row. How was it structured, which attorney handled it, and how long would the release take? He did not ask why Elijah had done it this way. He did not pause to question whether it made sense. He did not ask a single question about his father. He only asked about the money. Imani answered each question with just enough detail to sound credible and just enough vagueness to keep him dependent on her for more information. She told him the legal process could take 60 to 90 days. She told him she needed to gather the documents. She told him patience was important or the trust structure could be challenged in probate court. He nodded through all of it. By the time she stood up to refill her coffee, the lie had already settled into him the way a seed settles into soil, quiet, invisible, and completely alive. She kept her back to him for a moment at the counter. She breathed. When she turned back around, she was already wearing the expression of a loyal wife doing her best to hold the family together. He bought it completely. He always had. What Darius Brooks did not understand and would not understand until it was far too late was that the woman standing in that kitchen was not protecting him. She was building the cage he was about to walk into. Greed does not wait. That was the thing about people like Darius Brooks. They had learned to dress it up, learned to wear patience like a costume for long enough to get through meetings and dinners and family events. But underneath, greed had its own heartbeat, fast, restless, and completely indifferent to timing. Within 10 days of Imani planting the lie, Darius had already contacted 2 private accountants outside of the Brooks family financial team. She found out through a source at the firm, a quiet, loyal assistant named Bria who had worked for Elijah for 6 years and trusted Imani completely. Bria sent a single text message one Thursday afternoon. It read, "He brought someone in, not one of ours." That was enough. Imani began watching more carefully. She did not confront him. She did not change her behavior in any visible way. She continued to play the role of the cooperative wife, bringing up the trust occasionally, mentioning small updates, keeping the story alive and believable. And while she kept him focused on the fictional 80 million, Darius was busy creating very real crimes. He began moving money. Small amounts at first, transfers that could be explained away as operational expenses, restructuring costs, legal fees connected to estate management. But the pattern was clear to anyone who knew what they were looking at. He was positioning himself, creating accounts, building a financial structure designed to receive a large sum without attracting attention. He was preparing for money that did not exist. Vivienne entered the picture on a Friday evening, arriving at the estate unannounced the way she always did, like the rules of courtesy did not apply to her. She found Imani in the sitting room and sat across from her with the particular kind of stillness that was meant to feel like power. She asked about the trust. Not casually, directly. She wanted to know the attorney's name, the trust structure, and whether Imani had spoken to anyone at the estate legal office about releasing the funds. Imani looked at her calmly. She said the process was moving forward, but that she had been advised to keep the details limited to immediate family for legal protection purposes. She said it with the kind of professional tone that sounded like cooperation but revealed absolutely nothing. Vivienne's jaw tightened slightly. She pushed harder. She said she and Darius had a shared interest in the outcome of the estate and that she expected to be kept informed. She used the phrase shared interest the way people use language when they are trying to establish authority they were never given. Imani let the silence sit for a moment. Then she nodded once and said she understood. Vivienne left the estate 40 minutes later. What she did not realize was that in pressing Imani about the trust, she had also revealed exactly how deep her involvement with Darius went, and that every word of that conversation had been recorded. Aaliyah Carter did not advertise. That was the first thing Imani learned when she started asking quiet questions through the right people in Atlanta. Aaliyah did not have a flashy office in Midtown or a website full of client testimonials. What she had was a reputation that traveled through whispers, from attorneys to executives to women who had been in situations that required more than a lawyer and more than a prayer. Her name came to Imani through a woman at Elijah's church, an older woman who had known Elijah for 30 years and had watched Vivienne arrive in his life with the kind of concern that only people who truly loved someone could recognize. She had pulled Imani aside after the repast and slipped a card into her hand without a word. The card had one name and one phone number. Imani called on a Wednesday morning at 9:15, standing in the parking garage beneath the Brooks family office building in downtown Atlanta where she knew there were no cameras near the east stairwell. Aaliyah answered on the second ring. They met 2 days later at a small restaurant in East Atlanta, a quiet corner booth, no windows nearby, mid-afternoon when the lunch crowd had already cleared. Aaliyah Carter was not what Imani expected. She was composed in the way that people become composed after years of seeing things most people never see. She listened more than she spoke. She asked precise questions. She did not offer sympathy and she did not offer judgment. She just listened. Imani told her everything: the recording from the study, the trust lies she had planted, Darius's behavior with the outside accountants, Vivienne's pressure, the way Elijah had given her the key months ago, the journal, the phrase he had written inside it. When Imani finished, Aaliyah was quiet for a moment. Then she asked one question: how far do you want to take this? Imani did not hesitate. She said she wanted every person who had conspired against Elijah Brooks to face consequences that matched exactly what they had done. Not for herself, for him, for everything he built and everything they tried to steal while he was still breathing. Aaliyah nodded slowly. She opened a folder she had brought to the table. Inside were already 3 pages of preliminary notes, background on Darius's financial history, a flag on a transaction from 6 weeks before Elijah's death, and a name of a pharmacist in Decatur, Georgia, that connected to Vivienne through a secondary contact. She had already started. Imani looked up from the folder. Aaliyah met her eyes and said simply, "I looked into it the day you called. I needed to know if you were serious before I walked into this room." The two women sat across from each other in that quiet corner of Atlanta, and something shifted between them, not friendship yet, not exactly, but something more durable than that. It was trust built on shared purpose. The operation had begun. The evidence came in layers. That was how Aaliyah worked, not in one dramatic reveal but in careful, deliberate accumulation. She called it building the weight. One document alone could be dismissed. One recording could be challenged. But when you stacked truth on top of truth on top of truth, what you eventually built was something that could not be moved. The first layer arrived on a Monday morning, 3 weeks into the operation. Aaliyah sat across from Imani at the same quiet restaurant in East Atlanta and laid out a series of documents in a specific order, slow and methodical, like she was presenting evidence to a judge rather than a client, which, in a way, she was. The financial records came first. Darius had moved $230,000 across 4 separate accounts in a span of 19 days. The transfers were structured just below the federal reporting threshold, a clear practice pattern that pointed to someone who had done this before or had been coached by someone who had. The outside accountant he had hired was a man named Gerald Osei, who had 3 prior flags with the Georgia Department of Banking and Finance. Imani looked at the numbers and said nothing. Then came the second layer. Aaliyah placed a series of photographs on the table. The timestamps were from 3 separate occasions over the past 5 weeks. Darius and Vivienne, not in a family capacity, not in any capacity that could be explained by estate business or shared grief. The photographs were taken outside of a private residence in Sandy Springs, a property registered under a shell company that traced back to a personal account Darius had opened 4 years ago. 4 years. Imani absorbed that quietly. 4 years meant this was not a recent development. 4 years meant it had been happening inside her marriage long before Elijah became ill, long before any of the current events. She sat with that for a moment and let it pass through her without allowing it to alter her composure. She had always known something was wrong. She had simply never allowed herself to follow that knowing to its full conclusion. Now she had no choice, and now she had proof. The third layer was the one that changed the temperature in the room. Aaliyah pulled out a single sheet of paper, a pharmacy transaction record from a compounding pharmacy in Decatur. It documented a specific prescription. A sedative compound, not standard, not the kind of thing a general physician orders. It had been filled under a name that connected to a woman who cleaned Vivienne's personal residence. But the dosage schedule, the timing of the refills, and the dates aligned precisely with the period when Elijah's doctors had begun documenting his rapid cognitive decline. Imani looked at the paper for a long time. She looked up at Aaliyah. Aaliyah said quietly, "This is just the beginning of that thread, but the thread is real." Outside the restaurant window, Atlanta moved through its afternoon, loud and alive and completely unaware of what was being assembled in that corner booth. The videos changed everything. Not because of what they revealed, but because of who delivered them and the weight of a dying man's voice speaking directly from beyond the moment of his death, clear and composed and absolutely certain of what he was doing. Imani had known the recordings existed. Elijah had told her, not in detail. He had simply said one evening in his study about 5 months before he passed that he had taken care of things in the way that mattered. He had said it the way people say things when they want you to know without making you carry the burden of knowing too early. She had not pushed, she had trusted him. His attorney, a woman named Gloria Whitfield, one of the most respected estate lawyers in Atlanta, contacted Imani on a Thursday morning and requested a private meeting. Not at the office, at Gloria's personal residence in Cascade Heights. Imani arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Gloria led her to a home office, sat her down, and placed a sealed envelope on the table. Inside the envelope was a USB drive and a handwritten letter from Elijah. The letter was dated 6 months before his death. The handwriting was steady and deliberate. Gloria left the room to give her privacy. Imani read the letter first. Elijah wrote about the empire. He wrote about what he had seen happening around him, the way Vivienne had entered his life and slowly, quietly begun reshaping his daily routine, his medications, his circle of access. He wrote about Darius with the specific sadness of a father who had loved a son and watched that son choose greed over everything. He wrote about Imani with a clarity that made her breath catch, not with sentiment but with purpose. He said she was the only person near him who had never asked him for anything. He said that was the most important thing he had ever observed about another human being. He had transferred the majority of his assets into Imani's name 8 months before his death. The transfer was legal, documented, and had been witnessed and certified by Gloria Whitfield. It was uncontestable. Then Imani watched the videos. There were 4 of them. Elijah, seated in the same study, speaking directly into the camera with a clarity that made it impossible for any court to challenge his mental competency. He identified himself, stated the date, and walked through his decisions in precise, rational language. In the third video, he named Vivienne specifically. He described the changes in his medication. He described what he suspected. He said he could not prove it, but that he was stating it on record so that if anything happened to him, the people who needed to know would know. He looked directly into the camera at the end of that video and said, "Imani, if you are watching this, you already know what to do. You have always known. I trusted you with the empire because you are the only one who ever cared about what it stood for." The room was completely quiet. Imani sat still for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Aaliyah. She said 2 words, "We are ready." She chose a Sunday evening. The house was quiet. The Atlanta sky outside was deep and dark, the kind of sky that felt like it was holding its breath. Darius was in the sitting room when Imani came downstairs. He was relaxed, comfortable, still living inside the belief that $80 million was moving toward him through legal channels his wife was managing on his behalf. He looked up when she walked in. She sat down across from him. She did not raise her voice. She did not lead with emotion. She placed a manila folder on the coffee table between them, smooth, deliberate, the way Elijah used to close a deal, and she let the silence do its work for a moment before she spoke. She told him she wanted to talk about the estate. He leaned forward, expectant. She opened the folder. Inside was the first document, the asset transfer Elijah had made 8 months before his death. Darius's name was not on it. Imani's was. Every asset, every property, every account. Legal, certified, and filed long before anyone in that house had begun making plans. Darius looked at the document, then he looked at her. She placed the second document on top of it, Aaliyah's financial report, the account transfers, the structured deposits, Gerald Osai's flagged history alongside his direct communication with Darius. The numbers, the dates, the pattern, federal-grade documentation of financial fraud. Darius sat back slowly. She placed the photographs next, Sandy Springs, Vivienne, the private residence, the dates spanning 4 years. He said her name once, quietly like a question. She did not respond to it. She placed the pharmacy records on the table, the compounding prescription, the dates aligned with Elijah's decline, Vivienne's indirect connection traced in clear, documented steps. Then she placed the divorce filing. She had already signed it. The grounds were documented: marital fraud, financial misconduct, and the use of deception within the marital relationship. Gloria Whitfield had reviewed every page. It was airtight. Darius stared at the table for a long moment. The room was completely silent. Outside, a car moved down the street. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. He looked up at her and asked about the $80 million. She looked back at him with an expression that carried no anger and no satisfaction, just clarity. She told him there was no trust. There was no $80 million set aside for him. She told him she had told him what she needed him to believe in order to give him enough time to show her and the federal investigators who would be receiving a copy of everything on that table the following morning, exactly who he was. He stood up. She did not move. He opened his mouth to say something. She watched him search for the words, and then he closed it again. She picked up her folder, stood, and walked toward the staircase. She did not look back. Atlanta had seen big stories before. The city was no stranger to powerful names and public falls. But the Brooks estate case moved through the news cycle the way only certain stories do, not because of the money, not even because of the betrayal, but because of what it represented. A billionaire patriarch, a manipulated inheritance, financial fraud, elder abuse, and a daughter-in-law who had quietly built an airtight case against her own husband while standing in the same house as him. The federal investigators moved on a Tuesday morning at 8:45. 2 vehicles, 4 agents. A warrant for Darius Brooks related to financial fraud, unauthorized transfer of estate funds, and conspiracy to obstruct a legal probate process. He was at the Brooks family office building in downtown Atlanta when they arrived. His assistant later told people that he had been completely calm when they walked in, like some part of him had been waiting for it. The arrest photograph was on every major news platform by noon. Vivienne was taken into custody the same morning but separately at her personal residence in Buckhead. The charges against her were different and considerably more serious: elder abuse, medical negligence contributing to the death of Elijah Brooks. The prosecutors had the pharmacy records, the testimony of the compounding pharmacist who had been quietly cooperating for 3 weeks, and a paper trail that connected Vivienne's access to Elijah's daily medication routine during the final months of his life. She said nothing when they read her the charges. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran the story on its front page by Wednesday. National outlets picked it up by Thursday morning. The phrase Brooks estate scandal became one of the most searched terms in the country for 11 consecutive days. Gloria Whitfield held a press conference outside her Midtown Atlanta office on Thursday afternoon. She confirmed that Elijah Brooks had transferred his estate to Imani Brooks legally and with full mental competency. She confirmed the existence of the recorded videos. She confirmed that Elijah had made his intentions and his concerns formally documented before his death. The statement took 8 minutes. It ended the public debate about the legitimacy of the estate transfer permanently. Inside the courtroom, the trial moved with unusual speed for a case of this complexity. The evidence was overwhelming and largely undeniable. Darius's defense team attempted to argue that the financial transfers were legitimate estate restructuring moves. The federal prosecutors put Gerald Osai on the stand on a Wednesday morning. He cooperated fully. He had been offered a reduced arrangement in exchange for testimony, and he took it without hesitation. Darius's defense collapsed in the third week. Vivienne's trial ran parallel and ended 2 weeks after Darius's sentencing. The medical testimony was devastating. A forensic pharmacologist from Emory University in Atlanta testified for 2.5 hours about the effect of the compound that had been administered to Elijah and what it would have done to a man of his age and health profile over a sustained period. The courtroom was silent during most of that testimony. Justice, when it finally arrived, was not loud. It was simply present. The sentencing happened on a Friday morning. Darius Brooks received 5 years in federal prison for financial fraud, unauthorized transfer of estate assets, and conspiracy. He stood at the defendant's table and said nothing when the judge read the sentence. He did not look at Imani, who was seated in the courtroom in the second row, not at the front, not performing anything, simply present. Vivienne Brooks received 12 years. Elder abuse, medical negligence contributing to the death of Elijah Brooks. The judge spoke for several minutes before delivering the sentence, and the courtroom was so quiet that his voice carried to every corner of it. He said that the crime was not simply a legal violation. He said that the deliberate manipulation of a vulnerable elder, a man who had built something meaningful and trusted the people around him, represented one of the most serious failures of human character that a court could be asked to address. Vivienne closed her eyes when the number was read. She did not speak. Outside the courthouse, the Atlanta sun was already warm by 10 in the morning. Imani walked down the front steps without rushing. She was wearing a dark, structured blazer and her hair was pulled back simply. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had been through something enormous and had come out of it standing. Aaliyah was waiting at the bottom of the steps. The two women stood beside each other for a moment without speaking. They did not need to. The work was done. Every layer of evidence had held. Every decision they had made in that quiet restaurant in East Atlanta had landed exactly where it was supposed to. In the months that followed, Imani restructured the Brooks real estate empire with the same careful attention that Elijah had always brought to it. She brought in new leadership. She renegotiated 3 major contracts that Darius had compromised. She expanded the company's Atlanta development portfolio in a direction Elijah had always wanted to go but never had the right moment to pursue. And she launched the Elijah Brooks Foundation, a charitable organization headquartered in downtown Atlanta, focused on small business development and financial literacy in underserved communities across Georgia. The launch event drew over 400 people. Elijah's old pastor spoke for 20 minutes and had to stop twice to collect himself. Imani sat in the front row and let herself feel all of it. She and Aaliyah did not announce anything publicly. There was no need. What existed between them was not built for public consumption. It was built in the same quiet, deliberate way that everything Imani had done over the past year had been built, with patience, with purpose, and with a clarity about what actually mattered. One evening, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Brooks Tower office in Atlanta, looking out over the city that Elijah had loved and worked and built inside of, Imani thought about the morning she had sat beside him in that hospital room. She thought about what she had whispered to him. She had told him she would protect it. Every brick of it. She had kept her word. If you enjoyed this story, like this video and leave a comment telling me what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to get alerts for new stories like this one. Thanks for watching.